as one of my colleagues said, whatever we do, it's going to upset some people. Mm-hmm. So we might as well do the right thing. And, in general, we try to decide what is really in the best interest of the college, of Hamilton College.
Dave Bolger here, and welcome to Had I Known, a show that explores the journeys of some of the most interesting members of the Hamilton College community. This week's guest is Hamilton College President David Wippman. All right. Hello again. I figure if you're going to do a show about Hamilton College, and if you're going to mention what's going on at the school now, well, why not go to the top? And that's what we did. I had a nice chat with President David Wippman a couple weeks ago. And while normally on this show I like to have conversations with people about their experience, their journey, their career path, there was too much to talk about what's going on at the school to get into that, at least in the time I had with David. Now, I should mention that in the time between when I talked to David and now, a few key things have happened. You'll hear him mention how the NESCAC presidents will be meeting to determine the fate of spring athletics. Well, they have since met and announced that spring sports are returning to the NESCAC. So congratulations to all the athletes. They get to have at least some form of a spring season. And it sounds like the school has been able to ease some restrictions and allow students off campus, which is also good news. Normalcy starting to set in. But we covered a lot of ground. We talked about the school's handling of COVID, how the school is helping students deal with mental health issues, how the school's dealing with diversity, equity, and inclusion, including David's thoughts on the much talked about Diversity Council. And I asked David about his relationship with the current students. If you're an alum and want to catch up on what's going on at the school right now, this is a good one to check out. If you're a current student and want to hear from your president, here he is. Here's my conversation with Hamilton President David Wippman. Hello, sir.
How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. The sun is shining, so that's a good thing.
There you go. March in Clinton, New York, you get a little taste of spring a little bit, but you never know how much longer you got.
Yeah, it's right, exactly. It could be May before spring arrives. You never know, but I'm optimistic. I'm hoping it starts to warm up.
Well, that's good. I appreciate you doing this and making the time. I know you're a busy man, so thank you.
Well, I'm happy to do it. And I appreciate you doing this podcast.
It's been more of a pleasure than I ever anticipated. But
yeah.
No, it's been fun to have to meet a lot of people from the Hamilton community that I didn't know. And I hear from a lot of alums that they're connecting with the school in ways they never anticipated. So it's been fun. It's been a lot of fun.
There have been some silver linings to the pandemic that way.
That's right.
By moving a lot of the program into the virtual world, we're able to reach alumni that we wouldn't ordinarily see. So when we travel, we go to places where there's a concentration of alumni.
Yeah.
But we've got a lot of alumni who are scattered all around, and this way everybody can join in. So that's been good.
It feels like there's just been more, I don't know if it's outreach, but more opportunities to connect with the school than there had been in the past, for sure.
Yeah, and I think we're going to try and continue that. So obviously, everybody's hoping we'll be in a much more normal environment by the time the fall starts, fall classes. But we're going to try and learn from our experience this year and see what we can continue. And I think this way of reaching out to alumni will be part of that.
What else have you learned? So it's about a calendar year in now. And you had been public and vocal on what the right sort of approach was for colleges. Do you feel like you got it right?
I think so. There was uncertainty for sure. And, when I think back to last summer, we were seeing a surge then, which by recent standards was not that great a surge, but at the time looked pretty worrisome. And a lot of colleges and universities were making the decision to move to remote only instruction. And we were really committed to trying to give our students an in-person experience. We thought that was important from a learning and education standpoint, but also from a social standpoint. And so we really wanted to make that happen. And we were pretty confident we could do it successfully, but we weren't sure. We'd never tried it before. But we had a lot of people all across campus working really hard on it to reimagine, how education will be delivered. The faculty had went to tremendous efforts to reconceptualize their classes and prepare them for this sometimes wholly online, sometimes hybrid in-person online experience. And staff had to reconfigure all the spaces on campus, how we deliver food, how the residence halls are organized, the physical spacing in the classrooms, furniture, everything had to be reconceived. The admission and enrollment team had to rethink how we reach prospective students, advancement, how do we reach out to alumni? So it was really a cross-campus effort, and it worked well. We had relatively few cases in the fall. There were stresses for sure, and we knew there would be, but overall it worked well, and it's continuing to work well. We're still seeing cases, and I think that's going to continue through the spring semester. But we've learned how to manage them, and we know we can do it successfully.
What preparations are being made for the fall? Do you envision a return to normalcy, whatever that will mean on the other side of this?
I think we'll see something reasonably close to normalcy. Probably, there may still be masks required in certain circumstances. I'm optimistic that the vaccine is coming more and more reliably and in greater numbers, so that more and more people are getting vaccinated. And I would think that by the fall, pretty much everyone who wants to will have had the opportunity to be vaccinated. And that should really dramatically change things for the better. But as we did last year at this time, we did a lot of scenario planning. And so we had a kind of a best case, worst case, mid-range case set of scenarios. So the best case, I think, would be everybody's back in person. We're resuming in-person instruction, and we can operate relatively normally. Not fully, perhaps, but relatively. Everybody, is vaccinated, I hope, and we're in just a much better situation. Worst case scenario, I think, is the variants start to elude the vaccine to some degree, and we have to continue with some mix of in-person and remote instruction, some measure of physical distancing, some measure of testing. How much that will be, it's really impossible to say right now.
I've heard you talk a lot about your appreciation and commitment to Hamilton as a residential college.
Yeah.
This certainly has disrupted that. As you think about the disruptions, both positive and negative, and what you learn moving forward, does a remote learning experience continue into the future, do you think, for Hamilton?
Well, I think for Hamilton, we really want to be in person. That we think that's how we deliver education in best, is when students have an opportunity to be together on campus, not simply for the classroom experience, but for all the other opportunities that they have as members of a residential liberal arts college community, opportunities to meet informally with faculty, to run into each other on campus, to engage in athletic competition or the orchestra or a cappella groups, or all the myriad activities that are available to students. So we will, that's the future that I see. Doing blended instruction, which the faculty are doing, is a really challenging thing. We told faculty we gave all the faculty a choice. You can teach in person, you can teach your classes remotely, or you can do a mix. But if you're teaching in person, you have to be able to accommodate those students who have elected to study remotely, or students who might have to go into quarantine because they were exposed to a positive case. And so those faculty have had to teach so that some students are joining their class remotely and some students are in person. And that's a really demanding way of teaching, and it puts faculty to a great deal of work. And so when we get back to a more normal world, I think we'd like to have instruction in person and not to ask of faculty that they do that kind of blended learning for the most part. I do think faculty are learning a lot about technology and instruction when you have people remote, and we'll find ways to make creative use of it. So, one thing that's been around for a while is the idea of the flipped classroom. You record some of your material in your lecture in advance, and then you use class time for discussion and interaction. So I think faculty are really exploring lots of ways in which they can learn from what they're doing this semester, creatively apply it in the future, even to an in-person environment.
As I thought about this conversation and what the many things are interesting to me about your role, right? Mm-hmm. Leadership's never easy. And inevitably decisions are going to upset some people. And in your case, you have the faculty to consider, as you just mentioned, certainly the students to consider, and then, oftentimes an active and vocal alumni base. And a single decision can have impact on all three of those groups. And then there's the community at large. Right. I imagine COVID was an example of the decisions that made along the way. We weren't always seen favorably by some of those constituencies. How do you balance that in your role?
Well, you're right. It is challenging because different constituencies may view decisions differently.
Right.
In addition to faculty, students, and alumni, we've got staff, we have parents, we have the broader Clinton community. And so there are a lot of things to take into consideration. When we were thinking about reopening for last fall, there were some members of the community who felt very strongly that it would not be safe, that it wouldn't be safe for faculty, students, or staff, that we would risk spreading the virus in the local area. And we understood those concerns. They were reasonable concerns. We did everything we could to make it as safe as possible. So we tested quite aggressively. We were testing twice a week most of the semester, and then 3 times a week for students towards the end of the semester. Student-facing faculty and staff were tested twice a week. And we had a large team of people working on the protocols for isolation, quarantine, and contact tracing. And putting all that together, plus all the policies that we adopted in terms of wearing masks and physical distancing, filtration in classrooms and other buildings, ventilation, we were pretty confident that we could do it safely. But people who weren't involved in all of those efforts and all of that planning, and necessarily you can't have everybody sitting in together as those things are being decided. It wasn't as clear that it could be done safely. So we did get some concerns expressed actually from pretty much every constituency group, from faculty, students, staff, parents, alumni, and local community. But most people were really quite supportive, and most people were willing to give us the benefit of the doubt and let us try to make it work. And as we got further into the semester and case numbers were low, I think people said, okay, they're able to do this successfully, and I think most people really appreciated that. But it is the case that some decisions will be controversial. It's unavoidable.
And how do you balance that in thinking about it, aside from COVID, just managing through the various constituencies there? I'm not going to ask if you favor one or the other because you won't tell me, but but just in general, how do you balance that as a leader?
I think as one of my colleagues said, on an issue, whatever we do, it's going to upset some people. Mm-hmm. So we might as well do the right thing. And, in general, we try to decide what is really in the best interest of the college, of Hamilton College. And that takes into account all of the different constituencies. I think first and foremost about students, what will enable us to give them the kind of education that we want, to do it safely. And the other thing we think about a lot is how do we keep our community whole? So when we entered last semester and this semester, really those were our primary goals. We wanted to deliver a Hamilton quality education. We wanted to do it safely, and we wanted to keep the community whole. We didn't want to lay anyone off or furlough anyone. Those were our 3 primary goals, and we've been able to meet those goals. And when I explain those goals, pretty much everybody in our community says, yes, those are the right goals. They don't always agree on, how should we get to those goals? Mm-hmm. What is safe? We'll see disagreement around, when is it appropriate to go from one operating status to another status, or should particular groups be allowed to go off campus and under what circumstances? So there are differences on the specifics, but the goals are pretty widely accepted. And we try to balance it, when we get requests for making policy changes, which happens all the time, and we're constantly trying to evaluate, can we do this better? Can we do more to create a good and rewarding student experience despite the pandemic? And what are the trade-offs between heightened student experience and greater risk? And we'll discuss them. Lots of just different people are involved in these decisions. And we'll try and reach a consensus about what is the best course. And that's really what I'm trying to do is, build consensus around what is the best course. But at the end of the day, you have to make decisions. And I try and take as my North Star what is in the best interest of the college.
And thinking about students first, it's a very short window of time. It doesn't feel like it when you're in it, but it's a very short window of time, but a formative time, obviously an important time in the students' lives.
Yeah.
And now you have essentially 2 years wiped out in many ways in terms of the typical college experience. And then you add on top of that what had already been a growing mental health concern for students as the pressures at the high school level, and it begins there and then only gets worse in college. How are you thinking about mental health for the students at Hamilton?
It's probably I would say, our single biggest concern. And I think if you survey college presidents, and various people have, it's the concern that rises to the top at most institutions. So it's a national phenomenon, and it's not limited to this year, but it's certainly been rendered more challenging this year by the pandemic.
Right.
But we've seen really extraordinary percentages of students across the country feeling anxiety, facing anxiety, depression, stress, mental health challenges of various kinds. And that's been worsened by the fact that they feel that they are at risk of getting ill, that their loved ones are at risk of getting ill. In some cases, students have had family members who have died from COVID. They're worried about being put in isolation. They're worried about putting their friends in quarantine. They're experiencing a more limited set of opportunities than they had hoped, and then that they had reasonably expected. So it's a difficult environment for students, lots of stress added onto an already high level of stress.
Right.
So we've been very conscious of that. I think one of the things we realized this year is that as challenging as it was to deal with the logistics of pandemic response, all the changes that we had to make to everything we do, the hardest thing was dealing with the emotional and psychological ramifications of the pandemic. And we've tried to respond to that in a number of ways. The college has actually done a great deal in this area in recent years. We built a new health and counseling center. We have added staff, including counselors. We've added a lot of programming, and this year in particular, we've added new programs because of the pandemic. We have a peer counselor program. We've created a care contacts program. So the idea behind that was not everybody who goes to the counseling center really needs therapy from a psychotherapist. Sometimes they need to speak with a coach or a faculty advisor or someone in the chaplain's office. They need someone who can be a sympathetic listener and who can maybe give them some guidance, but not necessarily therapy. And so the care contacts program is to connect students with others in the community, in the Dean of Students office and elsewhere, who might be able to support them, but also to ascertain through an initial appointment whether in fact they do need counseling and therapy, and if so, to try and make that happen. And we've restructured our process so that students are now getting initial appointments, usually with one or 2 days, or at least they're available in 1 or 2 days, as opposed to, a year or two ago, it might have taken a week or more to get an initial appointment. So we are doing a lot around that. We're trying to expand the range of services that we provide, and we're always kind of reviewing. We instituted a 24/7, 365 program where students can get help immediately, through an online system. But it's a continuing challenge, and the demand for mental health support is continuing to grow, and I think will continue to grow. So that's something that we in every college and university are having to grapple with.
And are you seeing good utilization of the various services you're talking about?
Absolutely. Hamilton has very high levels of student awareness of mental health services and very high levels of utilization. And that's a good thing. We want our students to know that there are lots of different ways that they can obtain support. And we want them to get that support when they need it. And the students themselves are very cognizant of this. And Student Assembly has recently adopted a resolution focusing significantly on mental health and COVID. And yeah, I think our entire community is sensitive to the issue and is working on it.
Mm. Are students able to blow off steam? I mean, with the restrictions that are in place on campus and, challenges with sports, are the kids having fun?
Well, you'll have to ask the students. I think the answer is yes, but candidly, it's not the same as a normal school, as a normal academic year.
Right.
So a lot of the opportunities that students would normally have to let off steam, the outlets they would have, are either limited or not available. I would say in most cases they're there, but not in as full a form. So for example, on athletics, teams are practicing, they're meeting with their coaches, they're doing individual drills, strength and conditioning, and so on, things that they can do while physically distanced, but they're not at the moment having intercollegiate athletic competition. So the NESCAC decided that wouldn't happen with either fall sports or winter sports. The NESCAC presidents will be meeting soon to talk about spring athletic competition. And that's just something that I know is really disappointing to our student athletes. And that's just one example. Whether it's the orchestra or the chorus or a lot of the student organizations are continuing to meet, but they're not able to do it necessarily in the same way that they could in a normal year. And of course, we have told students they have to be careful about parties. We know that, if you're drinking and eating and your mask is off and people are speaking loudly because there's music playing, that's a high risk event from a COVID standpoint. So that's something else that is more limited than in a normal year.
How much whack-a-mole has the school had to play in preventing some of that from happening?
Well, we get complaints. Sometimes we'll get, campus safety will be called, and they'll say, well, there's a party down the hall, or there's a party out in the Glen, and they'll respond. So we have a disciplinary process, and we have had to give quite a few students warnings. Some students have been sent home. If they we had everybody sign a community standards agreement as a condition for coming to and remaining on campus, both in the fall and in the spring. And students had to abide by certain rules around physical distancing, wearing masks, gatherings and the size of gatherings and the location of gatherings. And we didn't expect perfect compliance. I will say that by and large, the student body has been terrific. They really, if you walk around our campus, you'll see pretty much everybody is wearing a mask all the time. Students have really internalized that and accepted it, and not just students, faculty and staff as well. So overall, I think the students have really responded well, and that's one of the reasons that we felt comfortable that we could have in-person instruction.
And then, how is the larger community, Clinton and the Kirkland area, adopted sort of the response to COVID, and how are students allowed to go off campus? What does that look like for you?
At the moment, so we have a grid, and an alert level grid, and so at the moment we're in what we call blue status, and students are not allowed off campus right now.
Okay.
We're hoping to get to green, which would allow students to go into the village, go into New Hartford, have more access off campus. And we set those levels. We look at a lot of different things. The first thing we look at is what is the trend line in cases on campus? How many student positives are we seeing? How many employee positives? We also look at the trend line in the local area. So when we brought students back to campus in the fall, the positivity rate in Oneida County was extremely low. It was something like 0.3 or 0.4%. When we were looking at bringing students back in January, as you probably recall, it got very high. There was a period where the average positivity rate for the week was over 10%, and some days it was over 13%. Fortunately, it's been trending down, so now I think it's around 1% right now. So it's come down a lot, but it's still quite a bit higher than it was in the fall. And one of the things we're trying to do is create a bubble.
Sure.
It's permeable. Most faculty and staff live off campus, and of necessity, there's going to be some back and forth, and vendors come onto campus for one reason or another. And so it's not a perfect bubble, but we're trying to, through the testing program that we have, create a fairly safe environment for everybody on campus. But our hope is to get to green soon. In fact, we were about to move to green not too long ago, but then we had several positive cases that day, so we held off. And once we go to green, then students will be able to go off campus and go down to the grocery store or go to Utica Coffee or wherever they might want to go.
Well, we're rooting for you.
Thank you. I mean, it's everybody I think around the world right now is frustrated. It's been going on for a long time.
Yeah.
And we all.
But that's the danger. That's where the slip-ups happen, and that's when you start to let your guard down. And yeah,
exactly. I think everybody's feeling pandemic fatigue. We're tired of the restrictions, and I do think if we can hold on a little longer, we're close to a much better environment. As the vaccines are really starting to roll out, some members of our community have already gotten the vaccine, have been eligible for it, and I think the number of people who get vaccinated is going to grow quickly over the next couple of months. But it's, for students, as you pointed out, this is a large share of their college experience that's been affected by COVID. They have 4 years here, and we're already a year into it. So it's a lot.
Yeah. I've talked to a few students who've reached out for career purposes, internships and so forth. And the stories they tell of, bags were packed to go abroad, and then the plug got pulled on that, and then scrambled to figure out what their semester was going to look like. And, 2 seasons of sports wiped out, and that there goes, 50% of their college career. I mean, it's unthinkable what some of these students are dealing with. Yeah,
it's tremendously disappointing. And, for someone like me, I'm I'm into my 60s. This is a small percentage of my life, but if you're 20, it's a large percentage of your life, and it's coming at a critical time. So they're losing something really important, and we recognize that. And I just can't wait to get us back to a more normal operating world.
And you mentioned it before, and I've had a conversation with a classmate of mine recently about, what did we learn at Hamilton? And so much of it was what happened outside of the classroom. And if you can't participate in those sorts of things, I had talked to Mark Randolph from Netflix, and, the ability to start a club and run a club and manage all that. Now, while some of that is still happening, not to the degree that it would normally, and those are life skills that you don't even realize you're learning at the time.
Yes, absolutely. And I think alumni generally will have that same experience, that, they value the academic program immensely. They're learning a great deal. We've got fabulous faculty, but a lot of the learning experience, a lot of the maturation occurs from just informal interactions that take place serendipitously in a residential community. And some of those are still happening, but not at the same level and intensity that they would in a normal year.
Right. And in your experience now at the school for the number of years you've been there, having also spent a considerable amount of time at Ivy League institutions, I'm curious to get your take on the Hamilton experience versus the Ivy experience.
So I have to separate out this year, because this year,
right, of course.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's a crazy year for everybody.
That's right.
But I spent most of my academic career at large research universities. So I was 16 years at Cornell. I was 8 years at the University of Minnesota, which is an enormous place. Both wonderful institutions. And I did my undergraduate work at Princeton, which, although it's relative to most research universities, more similar to a liberal arts college than others, it's still a research university. And also, they're wonderful places, enormous range of courses to choose from, great faculty, great opportunities of all kinds. But what I think a place like Hamilton provides, and what to me makes it really the gold standard of higher education, is that opportunities for participation are greater because of the scale of the institution, and opportunities for connecting closely with faculty are greater, partly because of the scale of the institution and partly because of the focus that we place on teaching. And that's not to take anything away from the other universities that I've worked at or experienced. They care a great deal about teaching and they do a terrific job, just as we care a great deal about research, and our faculty do a terrific job on research. But the emphasis is a little bit different. And at a liberal arts college, the emphasis on teaching is really critical to our mission and to what we do. So our students have opportunities for participation. I mean, University of Minnesota has one football team and we have one football team. It's easier to participate. We have, I think, 27 varsity sports. It's opportunity. I think a third of our students are varsity athletes, another 20% or so play on club sports. So those opportunities are just greater at a place like Hamilton. And I think it's just an incredibly enriching experience. And it's one of the reasons why you see so much loyalty and so much dedication among our alumni. It's really a formative experience here.
Mm. A lot has been made on this show and conversations I've had about the long-term viability of the small private college and the economics of it all. As that competition heats up, and what seems like an arms race in many ways for college facilities, how do you think about the long-term view of Hamilton and the small liberal arts school?
It's a really good question and a really hard question. For many years, really probably since I entered higher education, it's been 30 years now, I've heard every year that the business model is broken, that tuition cannot continue to rise the way it has, because we're pricing ourselves out of reach of most families. And there's a great deal of truth to that. I mean, our comprehensive fee is well over $70,000. That's an enormous amount of money. And most colleges are unable to provide the kind of financial aid that Hamilton is fortunate to be able to provide. So one of the great advantages that we have as an institution is that we have a very large endowment relative to our size. Now, there are, of course, some institutions that are better endowed, and sometimes I look with some envy at those endowments, but we have an endowment well over $1 billion. And that enables us, it's one of the things that has helped us be a need-blind institution. So as you know, we accept our students without reference to their ability to pay, and then we try to make sure that they have the resources they need to be able to attend once they're admitted. And that's a hugely important thing to us from an equity and accessibility standpoint. But we're in a position to be able to do that because we are a well-endowed institution. At the same time, when we look forward, we still have to face this question about how do we make sure that we can continue to provide the quality of education that we do to future generations. And there has to be some limit on the extent to which and the rate at which tuition increases, or at some point we will reach a breaking point. I don't know when exactly that is. We're cushioned to a greater extent than many schools because of our endowment, and frankly because we're reputationally a very strong institution as well. So if you look at what's been happening in recent years, I mean, this year our applications went up 26%, and many of the Ivies saw their application numbers go up sharply. Some of our NESCAC peers did as well. So some schools are doing really well in that respect, but many schools, probably most schools, are seeing applications either stagnant or decline. And so there are a lot of schools that are really struggling financially at this point. So it's impossible to look at a higher education as a monolithic entity. Different schools are positioned differently. And as I look at Hamilton, I think we're really positioned quite well, but we have to keep working at it. And it's one of the reasons we're in a comprehensive campaign right now, the Because Hamilton campaign, because we're trying to make sure that we have the resources to do what we want to do and to support our students. And so the single biggest pillar of the campaign is financial aid. We want to make sure that we can continue to admit students without reference to need and to give them the financial aid they need to be able to attend.
How much of the job as the leader of the institution is spent on fundraising?
It varies enormously. In a normal year, I'm traveling, and a lot of the time is simply, waiting in airports or sitting on an airplane, trying to get to Los Angeles or San Francisco or Chicago or, Houston or wherever I'm going. And so I would probably say, I don't know, 30% of my time maybe is devoted, broadly speaking, either to fundraising or alumni relations or dealing with related issues. In a COVID world, I'm not traveling. So that saves a lot of time. I'm trying to replicate the meetings that I would have through Zoom and by phone calls. And Zoom, as you know, it works pretty well. It's not as good as in person.
Sure.
But for when there's no travel involved, it's a big time saver.
Right.
So a lot depends on what's going on. When COVID hit, that was a huge amount of my time devoted to trying to deal with COVID-related issues, and still a great deal of my time devoted to that. That's something everybody has had their workload changed dramatically by the pandemic, as they've had to readjust and devote time to fulfilling their responsibilities in a different way. But on top of that, there's just all the decision making around all the issues that the pandemic has raised. So it's made it harder for me to devote time to some of the other things that I would normally devote time to. I am still doing it, but I don't have as much time as I did before. That should all change, I think, by the time the fall semester starts.
You mentioned the myriad issues that presented itself because of COVID. One issue that came to light in the middle of COVID, or at least came more to the forefront, it's not a new issue, was the issue of diversity, inclusion, and social justice around Black Lives Matter. And I know much has been made and discussed around the Diversity Council that was created in the wake of some of that activity over the summer. Curious to get your take on how that's going.
So you're right. This is something that the college, and I would say higher education, the country as a whole, has been working on for many, many years, and will be working on for many, many years to come. We have a long way to go, both as a college and as a society. And those issues were heightened, by the events of last summer, and I would say by the changes in the political environment, which date back at least to 2016.
Right.
I started in July, and Donald Trump was elected president a few months later, and there was a sort of a sea change in the political environment and the social environment, and it's been challenging to address those issues as effectively as we want to. I think there's a fairly broad consensus on the goals. That is, we all, or almost all, members of our community agree that we really need to continue to make progress on issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the college has made a lot of progress in recent years in areas that are visible and measurable in some ways. So, looking at the percentage of students who are students of color, at the percentage of faculty who are faculty of color. So on diversity, you can see some measurable progress. The equity and inclusion pieces of the equation are harder to address in a satisfactory way. And what I often hear, from alumni is that the concerns that they had are quite similar to concerns that today's students have. And so we haven't made as much progress in those areas as we should have and as we want. So in the aftermath of some of the events of the summer, one of the things I did was to ask a group of people who are dedicated to the college, most of them well known to the college community, many of them with deep experience on these issues, to come together to give me advice and to make recommendations on ways in which the college could make progress. And it's a great group of people. It's chaired by Josie and Amari, and you probably know both of them, Josie Collier and Amari Lee. It's got a cross-section of the Hamilton community. So there are faculty, students, staff, alumni, parents, trustees. We had two students. One of the students was unable to continue. And it partly emerged out of a set of conversations that I had with some alumni leadership and members of the Alumni Council who wanted to contribute some of the experiences that they had over the years to helping the college make progress. But it was never intended or meant to be the only vehicle by which the college would make progress in this area. It was simply one more group who could meet and was willing to meet on a regular basis to provide advice and recommendations. And that's what they're doing. They've come out with a set of draft proposals. They've gone through a feedback process to solicit feedback from the community, and then they'll present those proposals in a final form, and then the college will react. But what I try to emphasize to people is this is only one group making recommendations. There are lots of others. There are student organizations, student assembly. There are faculty groups and faculty committees who've worked on these issues. There's a group of faculty and staff who are working on these issues. There are alumni committees who are working on these issues. So none of this is meant to be exclusive or limited simply to the work of the advisory council. It's one group that I asked to provide advice. Something that happens really all the time. And my predecessor, Joan Stewart, set up a similar group, I think in 2014 or 2015, to give her recommendations. And I think there are a lot of good ideas coming from the advisory council, but we'll get good ideas from others as well. And we'll, as we get those ideas, we'll try to adopt them and implement them. And one of the recommendations from the council is that we develop a strategic plan focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So the college was already working on that, but that's, that'll be a work in progress. So there'll be lots of opportunity for any member of the community who's interested to participate and to contribute. And I encourage people. I know that there are some who don't want to work with the council, not because they are critical of the individual members of the council, but because they don't like the way the council was formed. Mm-hmm. And my suggestion is, look, engage with the ideas that the council has presented. We have a similar set of goals. Let's see, are these good ideas? Can they be improved? Are there things that aren't recommended here that we should be thinking about? Let's engage and let's talk about these things, and let's have those conversations, and let's keep moving the college forward. And that's where I hope we'll go.
So it's interesting. The intent is not that this council is the governing body of all things diversity, equity, inclusion for the college. You're open to any and all input and feedback from various constituencies across the community.
Absolutely. We're open to any and all feedback. Yeah. And I want to emphasize, it's not a governing body at all. That's why it's called an advisory council. It's a group that I asked to provide me with advice as a president who is interested in trying to make progress in this area. But there are lots of other groups that I've said over and over, I would welcome their input, and I want to hear from them. And I hope that they will come forward with recommendations that would be of value to us as a college.
To that end, one of the things I wanted to ask you about was your involvement with and engagement in students and student organizations. I talked to Christy Vilsack a few weeks ago, and she talked about being a charter member of Kirkland College and how much involvement the students had in the creation of what that school ultimately became, and certainly that legacy lives on through Hamilton. And I was thinking about that and just what voice do the students have? You mentioned there were 2 students, now 1, I guess, on the advisory council. Broadly speaking, the council and beyond, how are you getting input and feedback from the student body?
So we have lots of vehicles for getting input and feedback, and student assembly is one. The dean of students and I meet biweekly with the president and vice president of student assembly, and I've been doing that since I started. Sometimes students are included on many committees across the college. So for example, on COVID policy, last fall, the president and vice president of student assembly were members of the COVID-19 task force that the college set up to kind of oversee decision-making around the pandemic. And this spring, we have 3 students who are members of that COVID task force. And there are lots of other committees around the college. If when we worked on, for example, revisions to our sexual misconduct policy, we invited input from students. We have at least 3 student organizations who are active on issues of sexual misconduct, and we asked them for their input. We did a sort of a televised town hall to ask all members of the community to give us input. This was in response to changes in the law that were driven by the Trump administration and the Department of Education. And so we're really always looking for feedback. We have, the staff across the college in different ways is interacting with students all the time. So the faculty, the coaches, the various administrators are talking to students all the time. When in a normal year, I'm usually walking around the campus and trying to have lunch with students and just asking them informally. This year is another example. We're still working out what to do around commencement and senior week. And there's a senior class committee that we're working with on the planning for that. And we won't always agree. Students may propose something and we may say for, some set of reasons that we don't think we can go forward, or we can't do exactly what the students wish. But there are a lot of avenues for students to give input, and not just to me, to any member of senior staff or anybody who's working for the college. We've invited members of Student Assembly to present to the Board of Trustees on occasion. So there's, some the kind of the student-facing committees of the Board of Trustees. Students are invited to participate in those committee meetings. So there's a lot of opportunity for student input.
With all the pressure and just general anxiety with all things COVID mixed in with the diversity issues we talked about, what's the current relationship with the Student Assembly, for example? Well,
as I say, I meet biweekly with the president and vice president. I'm meeting with them this afternoon. Actually had a meeting with them at noon. I think we share a lot of goals in common. We disagree on some things. They object to the way that the advisory council was formed. They've set up a different group, which they call the Audit and Action Council. And I've said, I'm happy to consider whatever input that group wants. And I've also said, and they've said that they want to work collaboratively. I want to work collaboratively. The Student Assembly recently adopted a quite lengthy resolution with lots of requests around mental health and COVID. And we've been collecting responses from all the different offices involved in those different issue areas. And I think what is apparent, and the students will see when we're able to send it to them probably tomorrow, there's a huge amount of overlap. That is, we're already doing most of what's in the resolution, or it's in progress. And we're open to working with them on most of the requests that they've put forward. There are a few things which we're not going to do for one reason or another, but the overwhelming majority of it, I think we're pretty much in sync on. Mm-hmm. And sometimes, I hear, well, you're not listening to students. And I think that there's sometimes a confusion between hearing and listening on the one hand and agreement on the other. So there are some responsibilities that, the faculty have, that the administration has, that the trustees have as the formal governance bodies of the college. And there are some decisions which are really left to those bodies. So for example, we will get student input on faculty teaching. We do student teaching evaluations. And when we're considering a faculty member for promotion or for tenure, we will ask students, we'll solicit letters from students who have had that faculty member, and those will be considered actively in the promotion and tenure decision. But ultimately, the decisions on promotion and tenure, they're made in the first instance by the department, and then by some college-wide faculty committees who will weigh in, and then by the dean of faculty, by the president, and ultimately by the board of trustees on tenure. And so students will take the input, but the decision formally does not rest with the students. And that's true in many areas. And, the decision won't always align with what some students want. Sure. It doesn't mean that we haven't listened to the students. We do, and we take their input very seriously. But there are a lot of other factors that have to be taken into account in some of these decisions.
Well, you're talking to an alum who was there in the mid to late 90s, where we were just told that, from the students that came before us, that the administration was evil and they hate the administration. And so I appreciate to hear you. I know that wasn't true now, but that was the mindset, I think, of the student body back in the mid 90s.
Yeah, and I think there's something a little bit cyclical about that, and I talk with a lot of other college presidents, and I think there is a it's a moment in the history of higher education, in the history of the country, where we're seeing some increases in student activism, and in most respects, that's a good thing. I mean, we want our students to be engaged, and we say we want them to be active citizens, and they should be, and they are pursuing the goals that they think are important, and that's to their credit.
They seem the students seem far more active than my contemporaries. Again, there was a general apathy, I think, on campus when I was there, and I didn't see it as much.
Yeah.
There were pockets of it for sure, but
Right.
broadly speaking, it seems to be a more engaged student body.
I think that's right. And as I say, it's variable. It changes over time. I was in college in the early to mid 70s, and there wasn't a ton of student activism then. But if you'd been there a few years earlier, when
Sure.
Vietnam War was at its height, and during
Right.
the civil rights movement, there was a lot of college activism. So it's something that changes over time.
You mentioned talking to other college presidents. I'm reading, it's an older book now, but I'm reading a book about the U.S. President's Club, right? How current presidents work with and the relationship they have with former presidents. Have you talked to, or do you tap into at all your predecessors?
Yes, I mean, Joan Stewart has been fantastic. She's been a great support and a great source of advice. And so occasionally I'll call and say, hey, what do you think about this? Have you dealt with this? Do you know these individuals? What's your take? And I haven't. I've talked to a few of my other predecessors, but their experiences. Joan was here for 13 years, and now I've been here for 5. So anybody before Joan, you're going back 18 years, and it's
Sure.
That's not as helpful for current kinds of issues.
Sure.
But I also talk to other college presidents. We're part of the NESCAC, and so I talk to NESCAC presidents, part of the New York Six, and that's a terrific group, very helpful. I was just in a symposium from the Liberal Arts Consortium on Race, and I've forgotten the acronym is LACRELA, and we had a really helpful couple hours talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion issues. Usually I'll attend the Annapolis group meetings, which is a larger group. CICU is another group that's very helpful. So there's a lot of different ways to get input, and it's many of the issues that we are dealing with, everyone is dealing with in one way or another. So it's helpful to say, all right, how are you approaching this? What ideas can we get from each other? That's been very helpful.
So I know we're running up on time here, so I don't want to take up too much of your time, but real quick, we talked about your engagement with students, and you talked about alums. Aside from giving money, which of course you want everyone to do, what would you want to see, or what do you want to see from the alumni body in helping to make the school a better place?
The alumni can help in a lot of different ways, and we really have a wonderful alumni body. They love the college. They're engaged, most of them. They really care about the institution. They want it to do well. They want it to do better. And they can help not just by giving money, although I don't want to slight that option. That's certainly an attractive one. But they can help with career placement for our students in lots of ways. So they can provide career advice. Students interested in a particular field might want to speak to an alum who's in that area to say, what's it like? How does one get into this field? What are the pitfalls? What should I know about it? What's the trajectory? And a lot of alumni will assist us in that way. Some of them, as you have done, which is tremendously helpful, is to provide internships to students. We've seen lots of evidence to suggest that helps in multiple respects. So it gives the student a better idea of, what is the field actually like? Would I enjoy doing this? But also positions them, gives them some contacts in the field, and may help them secure a job down the line. So that's tremendously helpful. Sometimes alumni will let students job shadow for a day or a couple of days to get a better sense. And of course, sometimes they'll just hire Hamilton students. And that's tremendously valuable to the students, of course, and also to the college. Alumni help us with just engagement opportunities. So, if we're trying to we bring alumni as speakers. They've got expertise in pretty much any area you can imagine. And so we'll bring them either to campus physically or remotely, bring them to class, bring them for a more general event. That's been tremendously valuable. We've had some alumni volunteer to host students. If the chorus is traveling around the country and maybe they need a place to stay or a dinner, alumni sometimes will host that. And alumni provide us with expertise. So, when we were reviewing, maybe 4 years ago, we were reviewing our sexual misconduct policies, and we got a couple of alumni who were attorneys who had enormous experience in the field and really gave us expert advice on how we might modify our policies. And that's just one example. We get expert advice from alumni on technology, on all kinds of things. So lots of different ways that alumni can assist. They can do volunteer work of all kinds. The alumni office is always happy to talk about that. And of course, there's some number of alumni will eventually become members of the board of trustees. That's got to be, by definition, it's got to be a small group.
Right.
But they devote a tremendous amount of time and energy and philanthropic support to the college.
And then just give money.
Well, yeah, that's, we mentioned that option too, though. Yeah. Yeah.
So I asked this of everybody, typically about their time at Hamilton and then what they've done beyond, but curious, either throughout your career or through the 5 years at Hamilton, is there anything you wish you had known looking back?
So, when I think about throughout my career, I was an English major in college and did not take things like economics. And I wish I had. I now spend a lot of my time looking at budgets and thinking about numbers. And so, I wish I'd been a little broader reaching in my education than I was. And it's something I always encourage students, get outside of your comfort zone, take some subjects that you don't think necessarily are your strength or your greatest area of interest, but, explore a little bit. So I wish I had done more of that when I was an undergraduate. Something else that I wish I had known is a little bit more about how to communicate effectively with many different audiences. And the world is changing so quickly now, and there are so many different channels by which people get information, and it varies a lot. It varies generationally. It varies by virtue of people's interest in using technology. So, where in the past, maybe you just send out a newsletter or an actual snail mail letter to alumni or others. Now we're communicating by email, by text, by social media, by video, all kinds of different ways. And learning to do that effectively with all the different audiences, and the demand for information is extraordinary. And the interest in being communicated with by our students, our faculty, our staff, our alumni, parents, everybody wants more, and they want it in different ways. And so, learning how to do that is something that's a challenge.
Well, clearly President David Wippman has found the best way to communicate with the Hamilton community, and that's through this show. Just saying. My thanks to President Wippman for joining and for sharing an update on all the things that are going on the campus. And best of luck to the students as they finish out their spring semester. Seems like things are slowly getting back to normal, so good for them. You have been listening to Had I Known on WHCL-FM, Clinton, New York. HadIKnown.buzzsprout.com. Had I Known Show on social media. As always, my thanks to Dr. Michael Woods for supplying the music on the show. And once again, Doc is going to play us out. Hope you enjoyed the show. We'll talk to you next week.
Had I Known podcast show on your radio or take it to go.